So welcome to our second online mini mock, which is super exciting. For some of you guys, you probably would have all sat the first mini mock that we did earlier this month, and it's very much because a lot of students said they want to do it again. So we created another one. So it's so good to have you guys all back. We're going to very much get straight into the exam real quick, but I'm going to give you a few minutes to just get settled in, make sure you have all the paper in front of you, and make sure your sound is all good and that you can hear us, because Sarah will very much be keeping time for you, so you do need to hear when the time is up. Cool. Just whilst you're doing that, I'll just quickly give you a little intro of sort of how we're going to break the next few hours down, because you have a lot to get through. So we'll hop on to the next slide, Sarah. So for some of you guys who haven't heard of Halad, probably for two reasons. One, we're super new into this GAMSAT space, but also because we're based in Melbourne here down in Australia. And previously we've only been down here in Melbourne, but it's been incredible to see since going online that we've had students from across the world join in our Halad programs, which is amazing. But Halad is a non-for-profit where we do run Australia's most affordable GAMSAT tuition. And what we do with those tuition fees is that we take them to go and make a social impact over in rural Philippines, where we teach some of the most disadvantaged communities about some of the most important health topics so that they can prevent disease in the first place. So that's all what we do. It's all about making impact and being able to close that gap in global health inequalities. And truly, we believe that all of the students that have come and enrolled with Halad are people who have that in mind. So hop over to the next slide, Sarah. I'll quickly introduce ourselves. If you haven't met me yet, I am Eliza, the co-founder and managing director here at Halad, which just means I do a lot of the back-end stuff. And today I'll just be putting in all the links for you guys and giving you access to all the questions and making sure that you have all your live results tallied up as you get your explanations from either Sarah or Mish. And then we have Sarah. A lot of you guys would have already met Sarah before if you've done the first mini mock, and she is our head of GAMSAT and specifically a section 1 and 2 tutor and an absolute gun. There is probably I always say this, there is definitely no one else who wants to get you into med more than Sarah does. And she puts in every blood, sweat and tear into you getting the best education that you can get. So I'll get Sarah to quickly introduce herself, because I always forget to let her do that.
It's because she does such a good job for me. But hi, I'm Sarah. I am in my third year of medicine currently. And yeah, exactly like Eliza said, I do this because I'm really passionate about what I do. I love what I do. Medical school is amazing. And I really believe in everyone having the chance to, or having no barriers in place to get where they want to go in life. And so that's why I'm doing what I do. I love Halad. I first started my experiences with Halad when I went on their pilot mission in January last year. It was when Halad was just starting out, and it's so awesome to see the direction it's taking. And everyone, like all of you guys supporting all of our events, is so exciting. So yeah, that's why I'm here. That's what I do. And you're welcome to contact me anytime with any questions that you have. I'd be happy to help out.
Yeah. Awesome. What med school do you go to, Sarah?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I am at Monash Uni in Melbourne. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. And we also have Mish here with us today, and Mish is new to our sort of online events, but he's actually one of our section 2 and section 3 tutors who is taking classes right now, which is really cool. And I probably haven't met someone as hardworking and extremely humble as Mish. So I'll let Mish do a quick intro of him and sort of which med school he goes to.
Yeah, thanks, Eliza. So, hi guys. I'm a first year medical student, so I'm a bit more of a freshie compared to Sarah, I'd say. And I'm currently studying at the University of Melbourne. And yeah, so I do a bit of section 2 and section 3, primarily section 3. But yeah, I was part of the Halad to Health winter mission of 2019, and since then I've really liked where the direction that Halad to Health is taking, and it's encouraged me to kind of involve myself a bit more with the organisation, and it's kind of led me to where I am now. So yeah,
amazing.
Hopefully you guys can jump in. Maybe if you find a keen interest for it as well, you can kind of involve yourself even further in the future.
Yeah, well, as you can hear, Mish is so smart but so humble, and that's why we love him. But that is we're going to take you through today. And we'll hop over to the next slide. So this is how we're going to structure the next few hours. We're straight off the bat going to send out the links to the section 1 sort of exam, and you'll have 15 minutes to answer 10 questions. There are quite a few stems, so you do need to read quite quickly. Just a note on that, can you make sure that for everyone that you open the chat, because that is where you're going to be receiving all of the questions and the answers if you haven't sat this before live. So you would click on both of the links that I send out, and then preferably you have both of them open, and after there's one that's all about the questions, and after you read the questions, you'll submit your answers through the form. Once you've submitted your answers, we can tally up all of the cohort results for you. They're all completely anonymous, but I think it's really interesting for you guys to sort of see how you performed. And cool. I haven't sent the 2 links yet, sorry, getting ahead. But once we sort of open up the section 1, I'll send them in the chat. Just make sure that's open. And then so you have 15 minutes of Sarah explaining all of the most difficult questions. And during that time, I'll be tallying up your results and then sending the results to you through that chat as well. Then we'll go straight into section 2. You'll get 20 minutes to write on the prompt. Now, how much do you want everyone to finish, Sarah?
Yep, so completely up to you. You use your time as you would hopefully use it on GAMSAT day. Realistically, in 20 minutes, you should get a pretty good plan done, an introduction and at least 1 body paragraph, hopefully a little bit more. You're welcome to write an intro, a body paragraph, and then dot point sort of how the rest of your essay would finish up. So yeah.
Cool. And when same thing, you'll have the prompts and then an area to submit your essay, or as much of the essay as you've done. And once the 20 minutes is up, Sarah will talk through the prompt and give you an explanation of that. And on the end of that form, there'll be an option to say yes or no. Will you be happy if we use your essay as an example to give feedback? And Sarah will do live feedback on one student's essay if you've said yes to that on the form. So make sure if you do want that opportunity, tick yes. And then we're going to go into section 3. Last time, section 3 was a bit rushed for a few students with 15 minutes. So I've increased it to 20 minutes to do 10 questions, and there are 2 stems. So section by section, I'll be sending out those links and those live results. And at the end, you can ask Mish and Sarah any content questions or anything. And yeah, we'll go from there. So if everyone is ready to go with your paper and you can hear us well, can you just let us know by giving a thumbs up on the chat? And then I'm going to send out the links to the questions and then we'll start.
All right. And just for any of you who might have come in a little bit after the instructions were sent in the chat, so you'll have 15 minutes for section 1, and I'll let you know when you've got 1 minute to go. So just keep your sound up enough that you can hear me tell you when there's 1 minute to go, but I'll mute myself so it's nice and quiet while you're doing the questions. And then click submit when you're done. Also, just one other thing about the forms, if you don't want to do the questions in order when you're putting them on the form, you can go back and forth. So just to let you know about that. Oh, Eliza, it says that they need to request access. Oh, yeah, cool.
Just fixing the timer.
Yep. Just while Eliza's fixing that as well, just to let you know in terms of timing. So we've given you 10 questions for section 1 and 15 minutes. And then for section 2, we've given you 10 questions and 20 minutes. That matches the new amounts of time that you get with the new GAMSAT that you'll be setting for ACER in May, or this GAMSAT, online GAMSAT. So you have 2 minutes per question for section 3 and 1.5 minutes for section 1. So that should this should help give you a good indication of roughly time management and how you're going with that as well. Okay, perfect. So that's time. So if everyone could click submit on the form when you're ready. Great, looks like responses are coming in now. If you can send your questions in the chat, that's a bit easier for us. Yeah, thanks. Cool. All right, looks like almost everyone's responses are in. So Eliza's going to be doing some score tallying for you all. So doing some sort of like similar to bell curving for GAMSAT scores. But just off the bat, the average score at the moment is 6 out of 10 and ranging from 3 to 10 out of 10. We're just waiting for a few more, but I'll have a look now at which questions people seemed to struggle with the most. Yep. Great, okay, cool. All right, also just to let you all know, in case you weren't at our last mini mock, after we're done this evening, you'll all get sent an email with a recording if you wanted to go and look back over any of the explanations I give, but also we'll give you a PDF with all of the answers with explanations for all of the answers. So if there was one that you particularly wanted to go over that I don't go over, there will be explanations sent out to you in the form of a PDF. So don't stress too much about that. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So the first question that I wanted to go over was question 2, which if I just have a look here, only 22 people, so only half of you got it correct. So the someone has a question. Go over some of the poem questions. Absolutely. The poem questions seem like the ones which were the trickiest for people, so that's what I'll spend most of my time explaining. Just in terms of the first text, in terms of a couple of general tips, it's really helpful with these kinds of texts, and this is something that I like to focus on, to make sure that you're aware of what each paragraph is about, as well as what the main text is about. So hopefully you were able to get an idea of what the text was referring to and talking about, and what kinds of things came up, and that there were differences in the different things which were discussed in the text. So for example, there's a difference between things like presentism and what that has to do with simultaneity, and that there's a difference between special relativity, causal relativity, and hopefully you are able to sort of create these definitions in your mind as you went along, so that it could help you with the text and understanding the text, and also help you with interpreting the questions. It seems like question 1 was understood pretty well. In terms of question 2, 2 people do not always see the same lightning strike at the same time, or see the lightning strike at the same time. This is an example of what concept of time. The paragraph which could help you the most is paragraph 2. And specifically the part which says, according to the relativity of simultaneity, observers in different frames of reference can have different measurements of whether a pair of events happened at the same time or at different times, with there being no physical basis for preferring one frame's judgments over another. And so this is talking about how it's important to know, or talking about what the relativity of simultaneity is, and specifically gives you an example that 2 people just observing something and having their own frames or versions of referencing things can interpret something as happening at different time points, even if it's the same event. And so an event such as a lightning strike, which is the same event but does take place over more than one frame, could be interpreted by one person in their own relative frame and another person in their own relative frame. So they've both observed the same thing, and it is one event that's happening, but they believe it's happening at different times. It says nothing about how different the times are. It could be mere seconds, it could be minutes, who knows, but it's likely that 2 different people would report the event as happening at slightly different times, even though it was the same one event. And so because of that, that gives you an indication of this is what the relativity of I really don't like saying this word tonight, the relativity of simultaneity means. And so when you think about seeing a lightning strike at the same time in observers, then it's talking about that relativity of a simultaneous event, or of something happening at the same time and two people observing it. And so that's why you would go with B as your answer. So that one was more breaking down what each of those different options were in the text. So special relativity, simultaneity, externalism, presentism, and working out which one of those people observing an event or the same event and not seeing it as the same, which one of those that matches the best. So the easiest way to sort of get around questions like this is to make sure that you've really pulled apart each component of the text and understood sort of each thing that comes up or crops up, so that then when you get asked questions about it, you know which one is which, and you know how to insert sort of like or which part of the text is relevant to the question that you're being asked. So that's probably my tip to help with a question like that. But overall, it looks like you guys understood the text pretty well, which means that while you were reading the text, you were able to understand what it was talking about and understand the links between past, present, future, and different sort of philosophical theories or approaches to the past, present, and future. So that's really awesome. In terms of the cartoon, probably the only hard part is working out how the presenter is feeling. Overall, it looks like everyone was pretty comfortable with working out the humor in the image, which tells me that either that people were able to understand what the point of the image was or the joke behind the image. I like to talk to my students about taking a moment to actually understand the image and understand the whole point of it, and whether that's launching yourself into it and imagining you're there, imagining you're watching it, imagining you're the presenter, and helping you to understand and feel out the situation. So currently, like, the humor in this image is an ironic or is irony, because obviously the presenter is trying to talk about or give a presentation on the importance of paying attention to detail, but hasn't paid enough attention to detail to ensure that he's put his presentation or his piece of paper up the right way in the projector. So hopefully that was a point that you guys were all able to get to. The next point of how he's feeling, and probably I should have added one more word into this sentence, which is the presenter is likely feeling, or is most likely feeling, but it's still the same question. But how he's feeling takes sort of standing into his shoes and being like, hey, what would that be like? He's definitely not feeling authoritative right now. He's currently holding his paper and looking a little bit like, what? And that's something I tell my students to do as well, is look at the facial expression. And I know that a lot of cartoons are very simple and they'll draw them very simply, but his face, like, he's sort of just like that little mouth, like kind of open mouth, the way it's open, is this already like hints to the fact that he's looking a little bit confused. So that can already show you that the answer is likely to be D. However, we can already definitely rule out authoritative. He also may look distressed, but sometimes I also like to ask myself, not only for evidence, but for disputing evidence or things to dispute. I would dispute him feeling distressed, because I don't see signs of him shaking. I don't see signs of, like, it doesn't look like his knees are going weak, or that he has sweat like on his face or things like that. So you can look for signs that might show evidence, and if it's not there, then you can dispute something. Still, you could say that there's still a bit of distress, but I wouldn't say that he's at a point of like running out of the meeting because he's so distressed, or panic, like hitting the panic button yet. Compared with confusion, I would still go with confusion, because that's probably more how he'd be feeling. And if you're standing in front of your colleagues giving a bit of a presentation and you look down and you're like, wait, what? Why is it upside down? That's more likely to elicit confusion first, and then you'd get to the point of distress or hopelessness if you're not able to rectify it or fix it. We have no indication yet that he is at that stage of like being like, I still don't know how to fix it, because he's currently saying, which brings me to my next point. So as far as we're concerned, the point that we're seeing the cartoon in, or the like time still currently, is that he's standing there and he's like, brings me to my next point, puts the piece of paper down and is like, why is it upside down? So it's this point of confusion. So when you launch yourself into the moment, it can help you to interpret like where it's at and how people are feeling. I often tell my students to like see if they can feel the vibe. So like feel the vibe of the cartoon or the image, which feels a little bit like a layman's term to use, but it really does work because it helps you to feel out the moment and understand what's going on. So hopefully that helps you a bit with that one. Now the poems, this is what I'll spend my last few minutes just going over. Let me just check if it was all the poetry questions. All right, it was particularly questions 8 and 9. Okay, yeah, maybe we'll go over them. We'll go over them first. So question 8 and 9 both had less than half of you got correct. Firstly, question 8 I put in deliberately as a very difficult question, something that I find really important for poetry and something I'd encourage you all to do if you're in one of our Halad section 1 classes. We will go over this in class next week. If you're not, just do this in your own time. Go over each of the poetic conventions. When it comes to section 1, I don't believe in like doing a ton of study. I don't believe in finding out definitions or doing glossary terms, but I do believe that knowing some literary conventions can be really beneficial. So know the difference between metaphors, similes, rhythms, rhymes. Knowing those kinds of things in poetry can help you. And one of them is knowing what personification actually is and what it means. And this is a definition style question. All 4 of these are human traits. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. Personification, it has 2 main features. The first feature is human-like traits. That's ticked by all 4 of these. So eating and drinking, taking a hand, having opinions, and shaking hands are all human qualities or human actions. So that part's been ticked. The second part is that personification, for it to be true personification, has to be done not by a person. So if it's being done by a person, it's not personification, it's just it's just being a human. So you can't personify a person, they're already a person. So then it comes down to knowing which one of these options is not is a person doing it, because the question is not. So which one of these is being done already by a person? And that helps for you to know that, it is helpful for you to know the subject of each of the poems. Poem 1 is all about meeting a book, and all of the metaphors used are about the book itself. So things like his venerable hand to take here is taking the hand of the book. So that's personifying the book. So that is an example of personification. His quaint opinions to inspect. The book has the opinions in this case, and so having an opinion is a very human-like quality, and so the book again is being personified in this case. And then the final one that I use the example of, yes, to shake their vellum hands. Again, the vellum hands are the hands of the books. Obviously, books don't really have hands, and so this has personified the book. However, here, he ate and drank the precious words is actually the subject of this poem is different to the subject of poem 1. Poem's 2 subject is a real person. It's a human being. It's the man who is reading the book. And so him eating and drinking in the precious words is actually just him being a human, and it is more a metaphor because you can't eat or drink words, but you haven't actually personified the words because the words themselves are not the ones doing the human action. They're having the action done to them. So this is more of a literary question. You won't get a lot of these, but these are common in poetry. So that's my biggest advice, is to take a moment to find out what those different little conventions are, especially poetic conventions, and see if you're able to identify what each of them are. Similarly, if you're not sure what kinds of things you should study or look up for section 1, I would also suggest looking up key kinds of tones, so things like different types of tones and different types of humor. So they would be the main things I would say to actually find out definitions about if you're not sure. I will come back, Tony, your question I'll come back to in a second, but I promise I will answer it, and I will go back to question 7 for you, Harrison. In terms of question 9, this one's just a really quick one. What does the line mean? He knew no more that he was poor, nor that his frame was dust. Firstly, I would rule out see pretty much straight away, because this poem has very little to do with his existence. I'm just going to take one step back. How I said with Unit 1 with the philosophical style text, in terms of taking your time to actually make sure you know what it is about and orient yourself to it, do exactly the same with poetry. In fact, do exactly the same with everything in section 1. Take the time to be like, do I know what this is about? And so if you do that, then you should know that poem 1 is about the books and is about very much how the books are approached and utilized, whereas poem 2 is more about someone reading and their experience with reading. So they're both linked to each other, because they're both about experiences with books and like literature and like that kind of a similar topic, but they're a different approach, they're a different lens. And so by knowing what that different lens is, it helps you to know how to answer the questions about the two texts. And so in this regard, we know now that poem 2 is about someone reading books and really enjoying reading books. So it really has nothing to do with his existence and like, you know, his soul and all of that kind of like religious stuff. It like might be, but it's unlikely that he's reading a book about religion in terms of all the books in the world, and there's nothing there that hints to it. So we can't know that for a fact. In terms of his life being worth more than he once thought, again, we don't know if he's reading something about his overall worth or his what his soul is worth. So we can't really say that he suddenly had this epiphany just because he was reading books. So it comes down to hidden riches of his life, and that he's now rich in knowledge and culture. Honestly, it could be both. Both are applicable, both are plausible. And so then it comes down to which one has the stronger evidence. And in terms of this, what we know is that he ate and drank precious words. And so he believed that the words themselves, or what was in the books, were the things which were precious. So those are the things that are making him rich. And so he's now rich with knowledge and culture, because he's rich with the things that were in the text, as opposed to hidden riches of his life. Whilst the words in the books might be hidden riches, it depends on like how long they took him to find. It doesn't say anything here about how long he was searching for them, or whether they'd initially been hidden from him. So we can't really say that that's what he found, and that's why he thinks he's like not poor anymore. Does the question imply that he knew he was poor and his frame was dust? Yes, it implies that he already knew, or he believed that, or knew it in the past, because it says he knew no more that he was poor. So it shows that this was a once held knowledge or belief about himself, which he's now disputed with new knowledge. Cool. All right, and then just to go back to the tone in the above poems. Okay. B doesn't make sense as an answer, because it's not, because he wasn't actually learning about the worth of his life. He was more learning about the things, like the knowledge around him. And so it's not so much about like his personal worth. If it was like the worth of existence as a whole, or like even the worth of like knowledge, it probably would be more accurate. But this one is a little bit too, B is a little bit too much of a spiritual take on it. In terms of question 7, sorry, I know that now this is going a bit out of order. I probably should have just gone through all the poetry questions rather than just picking the 2 that people struggle with the most. So sorry about that. These kinds of questions can be difficult, because often they'll have one word that you know know the meaning of, and another word that's like a little bit like, I don't know if I know this meaning. And so that can be quite difficult. In terms of C and D, these 2 I would rule out almost straight away, mainly because neither of the poems are coarse in any way. They flow well, and honestly, I think what can help is when I read things to myself, I ask myself how they make me feel, and I also think about like, what might they sound like if I was to read this out. You can also practice reading it out at home. Just obviously don't read it out on GAMSAT day, because they won't like you doing that very much, but actually hearing what it sounds like for yourself in whatever way that works for you. You would, if you listened to it, it definitely doesn't sound coarse or brash or jarring. So I would rule that option out. In terms of uplifting and overwhelming, whilst there are moments of great uplift, so whilst like, yes, I would definitely say the tone is uplifting, I wouldn't say that it's completely overwhelming. There are, I guess, moments of being a bit like overwhelmed in emotion, but the overall or overarching tone is not a tone of being overwhelmed. In fact, both of them, the tones are quite measured, and it more shows this tone of reverence. And so that's when I'd come to A or B. So this is a little bit tricky because reverent and venerating are very similar terms. Venerating means like respectful and reverent, whereas reverent. And so it's going to be between A and B. So it's really choosing between appeasing and wondrous. I'm just going to show you all a definition of the word appeasing because I think it gets confused by people sometimes. Oh, sorry, I've put it in the wrong screen that I'm not sharing with you. But to appease means to pacify someone or to accede to their demands. So to appease someone or for something to be appeasing is to pacify something. And so it's not really what's happening in these texts. These texts are more people appreciating something rather than being appeased by the books. And so as a result, it's more this concept of wonder, which sort of helps to deal with this term overwhelming. And I guess they're not quite overwhelmed. They're more in this state of wonder and appreciation. And so that's why I'd put B, the two of them together, because there's this wonder towards the books and the texts, but there's also this veneration. So there's this respect. Sorry, can everyone hear me, or is there glitching overall? Okay. All right, beautiful. Also, if any parts of it glitched, it is being recorded from my screen where everything's smooth sailing. So if you miss a part, you can watch the recording later. I'm really sorry if it is glitching a little bit. I will come back to the question about what you'd recommend to ACE interpreting these poems as well in just a second. But just to finish up, in terms of how question 6, so how the poems different from each other, also just as a side note, this is very common. Hopefully you've all seen a version of this kind of question before in your GAMSAT preparation, where they will give you more than one poem and they'll sort of be linked, but they'll also be different. I wanted to put these poems together for the reason I mentioned before, in that they are about a similar topic but a different take on the topic. So your goal with those kinds of things or these kinds of tasks is to know what the similarities and differences are between the poems in terms of the angle that they're taking. And I think that really helps. In terms of actually answering question 6, Poem 1 definitely does use personification. I pointed out all of the points where there's personification taking place. However, Poem 2 is more using metaphors rather than similes. So that's when I'd suggest actually do go away and find out what those differences are. Poem, in terms of option B, sorry, I'm just reading one person's message. Oh yeah, no worries. So in terms of option B, whilst the Poem 1 definitely does honour books, Poem 2 is also still honouring the books. So its subject is now the man instead of the subject being the books, but it's still the man praising the books. So that's why you wouldn't go with B, because it's still not honouring the man. It's the man enabling like better knowledge and enabling appreciation like of his riches now because of the books. So the honour is still towards the books. Poem 1 is about books themselves, whilst Poem 2 highlights the benefits of reading. That's the answer. That is exactly what each of the poems is about. The first poem is all about how, like, what the experience is like with a book, a tangible book itself. So like the old volumes shaking their vellum hands. And I know some of this seems like very like old and convoluted language, but it's really highlighting the books themselves. Whereas Poem 2 is an interaction with actually the content of the books. And so then it actually is showing how there are benefits to actually utilizing the knowledge within them. And as a result, it shows like that the man or the subject in the book, he notices that he's not poor anymore, or he doesn't feel like he's poor anymore. And so it really shows these benefits of reading. In terms of tone for D, definitely there's a warm tone in poem 1. It's again knowing like sometimes words can throw you off a little bit, but an elusive tone is very like difficult to grasp and like sort of like vague. I wouldn't say that the tone in poem 2 is vague by any stretch. It's still similarly warm, and so that's why I would go with C for question 6. Just to answer a few little questions before we move on to question 2 and section 2, and like I mentioned, if any of your questions weren't answered, we do have full explanations that we'll send you after this as well, so don't stress too much about that. Would you recommend? Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to really briefly answer this one. What would you recommend to ACE interpreting these poems, any YouTube videos, etc.? Correct, we have a strategies masterclass that we ran about 2 weeks ago, it was, up on the Facebook page. We have the recording for that you can access, and I have pulled apart 2 poems in there and also done some philosophy, because I find that's what a lot of students struggle with the most, especially Old English style poems such as Shakespearean language. So definitely go and check that out. I spend about half an hour going through stuff like that. In terms of things to actually do though, my 2 like tips that I'll give you right now. The first one is don't get caught up on every little word. You will not understand every word of every poem that you read, especially old style poems. These are no exception. If you understood every word, great. If you didn't, that doesn't mean that your ability to understand the poems is jeopardized. So overall, see if you can take a step back and see the bigger picture of the poem. That would be my first tip. My second tip would be see if you can sort of like understand it in snippets and then join the snippets together. So I would try and understand the first 2 to 4 like sort of lines, and I would know instantly, okay, well, it's talking about a book, and then I would start flowing it through. You can also try like imagining it and sort of that imagery and painting a picture of what's happening in the poem as you go along. Part of it is just practice as well. I know that they say we read widely for section 1, and I don't like hearing that term. I think it's too vague and I don't think it's helpful. But if you're really struggling with poetry, I'd say like set a challenge or a goal to read like 3 poems a week, and then like read an analysis on those poems. So you could like pick a well-known Shakespearean poem that you don't understand, have a read through it, have a go breaking it down, see what you come to for the meaning, and then like go like analysis of this poem, and some real smart person will have written what the poem means and you can test how you went. So if you're really getting stuck on it, that's something you could try, but I wouldn't dive into that rabbit hole just for the sake of more GAMSAT prep, because if you're comfortable with poems, it's not going to like help you to keep doing that. But that's just something you can give a try. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say for now. If you guys have any more general questions, we'll wait till the end and you can ask questions then. In terms of what Eliza has just sent, if you click on the link that she's sent in the chat, the bit.ly that says student view at the end, you can have a look at the distribution of scores. And then if you look at what your quiz score was out of 10, then next to it is like an indicative GAMSAT score. I just like to always say for these things, like the score won't be a perfect match to like what you would have gotten, only because we have a much smaller sample size and the people who come to these events are already putting in more effort and more dedication than people who don't come along. So more just like take it with a grain of salt, but hopefully it helps you see how you went in terms of with everyone else. Cool. We do have a study planner. We might talk about that a bit more at the end, if that's all right, but I won't forget about your question. Yeah, no worries. All right, are we happy to move on to section 2? Yeah. Oh, look at that timing. Yes. Okay, beautiful. All right, I'm excited. Section 2 is my favorite section, so get pumped. All right, so Eliza's just sent the links there. Same deal, you will have 20 minutes. I'll just in case anyone's joined since we said it before, you'll have 20 minutes. Write what you can, but take your time. Don't stress about having to write a whole essay. Intro and a body paragraph is perfect. Hopefully it gives you a bit of time to plan. If you get time to write more, fantastic, like write write what you can. If you're happy for us to choose yours to share, just like tick yes, and we'll randomly pick one of those that have ticked yes, and we'll go through it, and I'll also go through some top tips in terms of this prompt. So that's just to sort of give you a heads up on how this section will work. And I'm excited to have a read of what you guys come up with. Sorry, that wasn't meant to start. I'm just going to change it to 20 and then we'll be good to go. Oh, I don't think it's sharing. Okay, looks like everyone's got access, so I'll start sharing now. And same, you'll just message if anything's not working for you, but otherwise when you're done, click submit and you should be all good to go. All right, and you can start now. All right, beautiful. So that's time. So whenever, if you can, if you haven't already, if you could click submit, and we'll let your responses come in. So like we mentioned, we're going to be bringing up an essay or two to critique and pull apart a little bit. Just while Eliza is going to randomly pick to do that, just while she does that, I wanted to go over a couple of general things to do with just this section in general and this prompt in specific. So firstly, sorry, just making sure I can see it. Yep. So firstly, thumbs up / hands up, or put in the chat if you took the time to reread and edit your essay, what you wrote. Okay, cool. Yep. So we got a couple. Only as I went. Awesome. All right. So this is something that's really important. And if you take nothing else from today, especially hopefully for most of you, it is quicker for you to type than to handwrite. So hopefully that buys you a little bit of extra time in terms of smashing out your piece of writing on GAMSAT day. I know that some people prefer to handwrite, but for the majority of you, you should definitely have extra time to edit. I know that we only gave you 20 minutes, but also we weren't expecting you to write a full polished essay for us. So please, 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 if nothing else that you get from this evening, please edit. I think the first like 5-ish that came through all had spelling mistakes and mistakes that would have been easy to fix if you had edited it and it was within like the first sentence or two. Whilst I teach the importance of, it's more important to get your ideas out and be concise than worry about spelling and grammar, it still like is so important to edit, and not so much because they're going to be super picky about spelling, because they won't, but if you aren't editing, it also shows that you're not checking if your ideas were correctly put together and that you've said things the way you wanted to say. So just make sure that you are checking. So that's the first thing. In terms of the actual task tonight itself, hopefully you all took a bit of time to properly read through the prompts. I made the prompt deliberately not too hard. Hopefully you all had something that you could say, but also gave you a little bit to think about. Something that I find comes up a lot, and I haven't had a look at any of your essays just yet, but something that I find comes up really frequently with section 2 is that people rush because they want to churn out a plan and get writing as soon as they can, and they don't synthesize what the prompt is actually about properly. So they don't properly work out the overarching theme or concept of the prompt. That same strategies class that we mentioned when we were picking apart some of the section 1 questions, when Gabby, my co-worker, does the section 2 part, she actually shows a really good technique strategy for how to pull apart prompts. So you might as well watch that part as well if you're going to watch the section 1 part. So this one particular, hopefully you all got that the overarching theme or topic here was about resources, specifically resource use and distribution. Now, in terms of resources, there are a few quotes which are about physical, tangible resources, such as, where's the one that I really like? Resources of the land and the right to waste them. And then this one about fresh water, tillable soil, forest, wilderness, etc. So you could have written about tangible physical resources. There's also things like utilizing resources. If you don't know how to use them, they will never be enough. Utilizing and activating are different. Utilizing means making use of resources. Activating means just turning on the on switch regardless of whether it's useful. So you could also go down the path of more like philosophical concept of resources, such as the resources of using time wisely, or like similar resources of talents and people's abilities. However, you needed to cover something to do with resource use and utilization. So this is a common issue I see, is that people write their essays on a really like lucid version of the prompt. It still needs to link in somehow to the overarching topic, and it needs to link in enough that it shows that you knew what the overarching topic was. So in that case, hopefully that's something that you all did and that you all did successfully. And that's just the first thing I kind of wanted to say about that, in terms of making sure that you've correctly identified the overarching topic. An example of not identifying it correctly that you could have done from this text is if you just spoke about the difference between utilization and activation, that would be not quite hitting the brief because you didn't bring in resources enough. Or if you just talked about being productive and had this lovely, beautiful piece about being productive, but you didn't put enough, didn't put any thing about resources, it shows that you didn't fully understand the quotes. So if that's something that you struggle with, maybe you were okay with it tonight, but you usually struggle with it even, go check out our strategies class because we went over it there. Just another general thing which should be across the board for your essays, regardless of whether it's this essay or any other essay that you write, within the first paragraph of your essay, regardless of whether it's creative or whether it's an essay, whether it's expository, argumentative, anything, I need to know what you're wanting to be writing about. What do you want me to know from reading what you've written? Even if you're writing creatively, I should be really well oriented to what you're writing about. So I don't want to read something that's all over the place. I want it to be clear. I want it to be really communicable of your idea. And that's so important because this task is designed to help test your communication skills and your ability to show qualities that would be indicative of a health professional. So if you're not able to clearly communicate your ideas and your thoughts, that turns up as quite a red flag. And so that's why I think it's really important to make sure you go back and you're checking your essay, because maybe it seemed really good when you were typing it, and then when you read back, you're like, hang on, this is really wordy, or it doesn't make sense, or it sounds kind of confusing, and that's not what I wanted to get across. So please, please, please make sure that you're checking that and that you're focusing on that, because I really want to know as I'm reading, I really want to know by the start if this is something I want to keep reading about. And I want to be reading and knowing what you think and what you'd like to say to me, and that this is your chance to say something about the topic, so you might as well show that. So those are the main things I would say. Now here is someone's essay has been chosen at random. I'm just going to spend 2 minutes having a read of it. I suggest you all read it as well, and then I'll give some tips and feedback around this essay. Just try and make it so we can see their planning as well. There we go. All right, hopefully you've all had a bit of time to read it. It's okay if you didn't fully read it. You should have all gotten sort of a gist of this essay and the approach that the student took. As a whole, I'm quite impressed with this. I think that they've nailed the concept of the prompt and turned it into something their own. And if you have a look up in their planning space as well, they've chosen to respond to quotes, and they've chosen already to make sure that they know exactly what they want to talk about. They specifically want to talk about the benefit of resources currently and what that cost is both now and in the future. And that comes across almost instantly in the first paragraph. I would say the first paragraph is a little bit long, but what sort of makes that okay is because this first part is really interesting. It sets a scene that makes me think, and the scene is very much rhetorical questions are a great way to do it. It doesn't have to be a rhetorical question, but what I like about it is that it's saying, you know what, it's so awesome that we have things now that our ancestors didn't have or weren't opportune to have, but what about in the future? What will be available then? And so there's this sort of like sustainability standpoint that might be being introduced. So it makes me curious and it makes me want to keep reading. So I think that's a good strategy. It's a good tactic. It's clever, and it sets the scene. It sets the scene, and it's relevant to what the person wanted to be talking about in the essay. So be aware when you try to add in things that are like interesting and things like this, only do it if it actually matches what you're going to be saying and talking about. Don't just do it for the sake of thinking you sound really clever or really smart. One thing that I was talking to Eliza about before was like, as markers, we can tell, I've read a lot of essays. I know where you're coming from. I know if you're trying to bluff or trying to sound like really clever or like over sophisticated. Just say what you want to say it carefully, say it wisely, take your time to think. I can always tell when someone's pre-planned an essay and just chucked it in and tried to fit a mold. So just be really mindful of things like that. But this is done, this is great. In this part here, I know for a fact that this person is then going to talk about global impacts as well. This is something I love because when I speak to my students, one of the things I find that a lot of students struggle with is adding complexity to their opinions. They start out with an opinion, but they can't back it up enough. They give an opinion and they give an example and they think that they're done. And I say, come on, I want a little bit more complexity. And it's really hard to get people to do that. My two biggest tips for that are either A, pick something that shows the impact of your opinion. And that's what this person has done really well. If you have a look at this paragraph as well, it talks about, it has a lovely example about sending Americans to war and about how this utilized a lot of resources which were quite lucrative at the time, resources such as the young, like the fit, the healthy, the working class, and using them in war. A fantastic example. And it and things even like actual physical resources. This person saw the difference between a physical resource and also resources such as talent and individuals. And I think that that showed depth already. But then it also talks about actual overall impact. And this shows some complexity. What about modern day youth activists, such as we all know about Greta Thunberg now, and the how dare you concept, and whether like this meant that World War II was the wrong decision or not, or one which meant that now there's a better impact on people's lives now because of what happened in the war. So the reason why I like this here is because what could have happened is that, or what I see a lot of in essays, is people stop after kind of here and they say, okay, yep, I'm done. I've shown my point. I've shown my point that sometimes resources are used for things. Cool, which is fine. But adding this extra depth of what next? What does that mean for now? What does that mean for the future? How does that impact people? How does that impact humanity? Shows that you're thinking. It shows that you're thinking about the next step. It shows that you're thinking beyond just the point that you've made. So it's really clever and thoughtful to do that. You can also take so that's the first one, show impact, or a different approach could be show a philosophical approach. So what does this say about humankind overall, such as maybe this one, if it took a more philosophical approach, the person could write, this shows the willingness to sacrifice things in times of need for the greater good, or shows that like people's morals, such as utilitarian morals, come out to play, come out when in times of need and people are willing to sacrifice for war. So that's also another angle that could be taken. That's just an example of how you can add some complexity, because I think that a lot of the issues that come up with section 2 is that people tend to have similar arguments because you're all writing about the same theme, and people struggle and worry, like, how can I make mine unique? How can I make it different? How can I make it enjoyable for the examiners to read when they're already reading thousands of essays? And this is the key. Have interesting examples and doing exactly what this student has done, putting in something extra, putting in some complexity. Saying that, putting in something extra does not mean that I want to read a double length essay. Less is still more, quality is still better than quantity. You only need to put in a sentence. It doesn't need to then be a whole nother paragraph about complex impacts and things like that. Just a little sentence to link it back to something that's a little bit more deeper, or a little deeper, or with a little more depth than the point that you made, and that's perfect. So in terms of this essay, if I was finishing off this essay, to like keep it going at this caliber and to like end it off just as amazing as it started, I would be putting in these things that were here about the future generations, because they've spoken about the past generations. I'd be talking about the future generations and about impact. And then I'd probably have sort of like a bombshell sort of ending where I'd talk about something like, you know, the detriment of not having a positive impact in the future, or something similar to that. So some sort of philosophical and bombshell ending, or something that's like about human impact, because they really want to see that you're able to think, and you're able to think about humans as a whole. You're able to think about human health and well-being and societal structure. And so if you're able to show like indications that you understand those kinds of things, you're far better off than if you just go, here's my 3 opinions and this is why I think this. So that's what I would sort of give as my main feedback for an essay like this. Awesome. Would you have to define something like utilitarian approach? Definitely, yes. So you would need to define what it means. You don't even need to use words as fancy as that. You could literally just say, it's interesting how we'll do things for the greater good of humanity, and we'll give up things that are valuable to us for the greater good of humanity. You know, it shows that humans can be kind, or whatever it is that you think. You still need to make it your own opinion. That's just one example. But yes, definitely explain the things that you say. Yep. Cool. Did anyone have any other questions about section 2, specifically this task, but maybe things in general that I've mentioned? Just a small question. If we wanted to refer to that small quote. Yep, great question. You can either write anonymous, or you can put the quote in context so that you don't have to quote the author. You could just be like, according to the quote, blah, or you could even just put the quote in and put quotation marks around it. The examiners know that you don't know who the author is. You're not going to be disadvantaged because you weren't given the author. You can definitely use I and personal opinion. It doesn't matter whether it's task A or B. People tend to think that it does. It definitely doesn't, but just be wary of like the type of tone that you want your essay to have overall. Like I said, when you read back your essay, ask yourself if it sounds like what you want it to sound like. And if your strongest opinion, or your opinion is strongest when you use a personal anecdote or personal experience, go for it. My advice with that is to still give it that same link of complexity and link it back to something more meaningful than just going, look at me and what it was like for me. Actually link it back so it shows purpose and meaning. And I've seen a lot of fantastic task A style writing where people have done that. Yeah. Reminder to read out the questions. Oh, yeah. Yep, I will show you a scoring rubric in a second. I do have one. What is a question we can ask ourselves to add complexity to our ideas? What are your best tips? Yep, so I would suggest you go after this session and create your own list of questions that helps you. When I try to put something more philosophical in, I have a separate list of questions to when I try to put something more like impact or future impact in. But usually my questions will be things like, for impact, it will be, what does this mean for the future? How does this make people feel? How does this change society, and how does this change individuals? So I'll do an individual and a society approach, and I'll have that like, how does it make them feel? What does this mean next? And how does it invoke change? So those would be the things I'd be asking myself, and the kinds of things I'd be asking myself. For a more philosophical approach, I'd be looking at, what does this say about human behavior and human nature? What does this say about the individual versus society as a whole? Questions like that. If you're kind of stuck on what it is, you can literally just Google it. That's what I did back when I was writing. I Googled like top philosophical questions, and a lot of things came up. Things like, what does this say about people's values? What does this say about humanity and morals? And so you can ask yourself these questions and get used to answering them and thinking about that next step. Might be a weird question, but is task A and B marked by the same examiner? Not a weird question at all, but I honestly don't know. ACER is like a locked box with a lot of things that they do in marking. I'm going to show you that on the marking rubric in a second. But yeah, sorry, I have no idea. Yeah. Oh, what would you have written about? Great question. I might answer that in a second. I'm just going to scroll up and check the ones I've missed. Would you recommend referencing multiple quotes? So I'm a big believer in, I don't care how you say what you're saying. I just care that you say it and that you say it properly. So how you say it is less important than what you actually have to say. And I just want to know what you have to say. So how you do it, up to you. If you want to use all quotes, it's hard, but good luck, but you theoretically could. If you want to use none of the quotes, if you want to use one, if you want to use two, I don't really mind. It doesn't matter. The examiners don't mind. They want to hear from you. So my advice with that is, if you're using a quote just so that you can use the quote, but it's not helping you, then that's actually going to hurt you. So leave the quote out. But if the quote is really poignant for you and it's really like driving home what you're saying, then you can use multiple quotes. You can use one, you can use all. I've never seen anyone use every single quote, but theoretically you could. But yeah, so up to you. Okay. All right. What would you have written about? Or maybe should I do the scoring first? Let's see. I think these are the only 2 questions left. Okay. I might talk about what I would have written about first. In terms of I like this because actually yesterday I was thinking, you know what, for one of my prompts, I should actually write something and I'll like give it to all my students, because I rarely actually sit and think about what I would write, because I think it's really important for me as a marker to remain impartial and not favor someone because they wrote something similar to me. But when I actually think about this and what I genuinely am passionate about and would write about, 2 things come to mind. The first one is human resources and actually like human talent. And so I would want to write about that and my passion about that, and how there's a lot of ethical disparity in human resources currently. And so that's something that I would want to write about. So things like unfairness in the workforce and in hiring, and that there's a lot of unfairness. One of the examples that I was really passionate about had a lot to do with the fashion industry, and the people in my classes have heard me talk about this a lot. So I'm sorry for those who are here and hearing this for the umpteenth time. But one of the things that I find like really sad about the fashion industry is that there's a lot of resource, a lot of like resource misuse, and a lot of plundering and things which are really negative. And so that's something that I feel really strongly about, especially sustainability and ethics in fashion resource use, and how it also creates vicious cycles of disparity in economics and in socioeconomic classes. And so that's something that I would really want to talk about. And so I'd probably build a contention around that and around the unfairness in resource use. I really find the dichotomy between the glamour of the fashion and beauty industry and the ugliness underneath really interesting. So I'd probably talk about that and how sometimes we use resources to make something beautiful, but it's actually really ugly underneath. And so, yeah, I think that's probably the standpoint I would take, and that it's actually, we need to be more ethical in how we use our resources. And that, yeah, there's so much behind that I could talk about for hours. And so I would structure an argument around that and around sort of, yeah, ethical use of resources. And my examples would come from sort of an industry that appears really beautiful and glamorous and very highbrow, but actually it's quite sad what happens behind the scenes, and we need to be mindful of that. So yeah, that's what I would write about. Thanks for asking. It's fun to get to think about it and have a say on it. Cool. Beautiful. Exploitation, that's the word I was thinking of. Perfect. She's reading my mind. Okay, just to finish up, I'm just going to grab up the rubric for you guys that I like to use. Sorry, it'll just take a moment for me to find it. I might just quickly, you can all take a deep breath because you're about to start section 3, which I know is super exciting for everyone, everyone's favorite, I'm sure. Okay, here we go. All right, so just really quickly to go through this, this is something that I've created myself over time. It's definitely not something that's been endorsed by ACER. Unfortunately, in all of the things I've read from ACER, they've only released very limited things on how they mark. The main thing that they have released is that they have 2 key criteria that they use to mark your essays. The first one is this first dot point here, the quality of thinking about the topic, and the second one is the use of language demonstrated in the development of understanding. And then here, just so that I can help, especially when I enlist other people to help me with marking, these are sort of the key points that I like people to check if they're in the essay to help in assigning scores for each of these sort of 2 top criteria. And so in terms of the thought and quality, thought and content, this is mainly looking at the quality of your writing. So I always ask myself, do they have something clear to say? In the essay we just looked at, yep, they had something clear to say. Are their ideas relevant, interesting, and important? Absolutely. Can you see a part of the student in their essay? That's something I like to ask myself. Can I see something about them? Like in the example I gave, hopefully they would see passion in the things that I would say about the ethics behind resource distribution. Do they reflect qualities of a future health professional? And is it generic? And so that's what I sort of was talking about in my breakdown, that I really liked that they added a complexity so that their argument like moved from being really generic and being the same argument that a lot of other people would be writing about. They offered a complexity. So that's what these 2 criteria these are the questions I ask myself to be able to answer that. And then in terms of the use of language demonstrated, that doesn't mean like, were they super eloquent? Did they use amazing big words? We don't really care about that. We more care about your structure, your style, and your tone. So was it really easy for me to follow? Were you jumbled and all over the place? Did you use a tone that was really appropriate? Is it professional? Is it friendly? Or is it making me feel like we're going to end up in a fight because you're sounding really arrogant or annoying or standoffish? Also, is it memorable? Do I walk away from it after that sort of like, is there like a bombshell moment or something where I walk away and I'm like, yeah, they wrote in a way where it's like, I want more and it's interesting and I'm thinking about it. So that's more what it's got to do with how you express yourself versus like, I don't really care if you were able to find an amazing synonym for another word. You can keep your words simple. In terms of the one that we did, just to finish up, for like theme and content, I would put it in like an excellent, a good to an excellent, probably a 4.5 out of 5. Thoughts and feelings offered, I'd give a 4.5 as well. Like I said, I thought that they gave that complexity and that was really important and helpful for their essay. And that's something that I don't see in a lot of essays. So really good. Shape and form, very clear. I would give it a good, I'd give it a 4. Like I said, the intro could probably be a bit shorter. Probably the thing I would say, because GAMSAT essays are meant to be short and concise, you don't need to preempt all of the different points you're going to be making. You can just make like a really like thought-provoking statement, and then you can say like what your main contention or main idea is if you're using a general essay structure. If you're writing something creative, it should also be a fairly like thought-grabbing sort of statement / short paragraph at the start. And effectiveness and fluency of language. There are a couple parts where it wasn't as fluent. This person probably needed to just check over it once more. So I'd give it like a high good. Yes, like a 4. Sorry, I should have been counting that up as I went, but hopefully you all did in your heads. If not, I'll listen back over the recording and say what the actual score was for it. But saying that the mark itself is not super relevant, I would say a mark around 16 is really, really great. Like if people are getting 16 and above, you should feel awesome about what you're writing. But in terms of like the mark itself, I more give this to students so they can see how they're improving amongst themselves. And we use them when we mark everyone's in our actual mock exam so that we can bell curve you. But the mark itself, it doesn't really mean anything without being bell curved first. So yeah, a lot of people ask like, oh, but like what would be like a GAMSAT score of 70, and the real answer is I don't know. It depends on how hard the prompt is. It depends on how everyone else went as well. So that part's a little bit tricky, but hopefully that gives you guys a bit of insight into what they're actually looking for and what sort of matters. The only other thing is that if you write on the wrong theme, or you just like, you write an awesome essay, but you've just sort of gone off track onto a different theme, then all of your mark will be scaled down. So let's say that like it was all excellent, like your content and everything, like your shape, your form, your fluency was all fantastic, but you wrote on like the productivity instead of resources, then I would like scale that all back down to something like maybe only an average or even acceptable. So please, 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 first and foremost, make sure that you're writing on the correct topic and theme. That's more important than making sure you have the most sophisticated, amazing essay and it's on the wrong thing. All right, fantastic. I feel like if we get a copy of this marking guide, sure. Yes, definitely. Cool. Okay, she's taking care of it. Yes, you all have a copy of it now. Please like use it as you're doing your own. Something that I want my students to know how to do is reflect when they write. Take the time. This is going to be my final thing for today. Like I said, edit. If that's all you take away, please, please, please edit. If you have the time, you might as well. And secondly, and I think Eliza said something really good to me before. She's like, you're spending $500+ to sit this exam. You might as well spend the extra few minutes you have at the end to reread it, because like your minutes are money right now. So you might as well use it. So that's the first one. And the second one, when you're practicing at home, when you're writing things, take the time. You can use this rubric now if you like. Take the time to sit and have a go, sort of self-marking it. And seeing like, you know, am I improving at the things I struggle with? So that would be my other advice. If you've got a study group, if you've got friends who are happy to read it, if you've got family who can read it for you, ask them to read it, ask them to give you advice. You can even show them this rubric and they can help you out. So that's what I would recommend for section 2. But yeah, thanks guys, and good luck. That's all from me for now. We will also take time to answer questions at the end. Sorry, I'll stop sharing this. And yeah, I will hand it over. Actually, I might start you on section 3, and then Mish will actually take the section 3 portion and he'll explain all of section 3, the answers for you. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so Eliza's just sent the section 3 questions, and I'll set up the timer again for you all. All right, and you'll have 20 minutes and you've got 10 questions. And I'll let you know when you have a minute to go, and you can start now. All right, and that's time. So like I said, don't forget to click submit, and I'm going to hand it over now to Mish so that he can walk you through some of the section 3 answers and things that people found challenging.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I'm just having a look at the responses, and there's about 33 at the moment, and the average was around 4.18, which was good. In terms of questions in particular that I might want to discuss, it does seem quite a few of you had a bit of trouble with the first STEM, so unit 1. So I might actually go through that one as a whole, just so that I can give you a bit more of a holistic understanding of what I was actually being kind of displayed in that question. I know physics can sometimes be quite daunting. It was for me as well. So unpacking that question and really delving into what essentially it was talking about can be really useful. So I'm just going to share my screen, and let's have a look. Yeah, okay. So I might just move this down here. Okay, cool. So if we look at this question, there is a lot of information there, first and foremost. So it can be quite intimidating a lot of the time, just seeing this kind of slab of information and a lot of letters and numbers, etc. So it's important to kind of, when you're reading through it, kind of gauge what the information's trying to tell you. So in this case, if I were to approach this question, I'd read it through and kind of figure out what each sentence is kind of trying to suggest. So if we look here, it says, before Planck's hypothesis, physicists tried to describe spectral radiance of electromagnetic radiation by classical physics. The approximation based on classical physics is known as Rayleigh-Jean's law, which provides the spectral radiance of a body as a function of its frequency and temperature. So it is quite dense in what it's trying to say, but simply put, we can identify that there's a thing called Rayleigh-Jean's law, and it provides the spectral radiance of a body as a function of its frequency and temperature. So we can essentially say that frequency and temperature are variables within Rayleigh-Jean's law that determine or govern the spectral radiance of a certain body. And here we have a few units, and I've already started to notice that Boltzmann's constant is missing a unit. So that could be a potential question that is likely to come up. So I might keep a mental note in the back of my mind about having to come back to this question, to this part of the question in the future. And then we see here that the electromagnetic spectrum predicted by Rayleigh-Jean's law has failed. And then Max Planck has proposed a new kind of formula, which is shown here, which revises Rayleigh-Jean's law. So importantly, it's mentioned that all the other variables have the same definition as in Rayleigh-Jean's law. So a lot of the kind of things or aspects of Rayleigh-Jean's law can be transferred over to Planck's constant. So with that in mind, we can proceed further to look at this visual diagram. And it's mentioning this idea of UV visible spectrums and infrared. And then finally, we have a few extra formulas. So let's just have a look at the question one, because question one was a question that a lot of you found quite difficult. And I'm assuming I'm coming into this question without a lot of knowledge, previous knowledge about spectral radiance. And I assume a lot of you might not have a lot of knowledge about that. So let's just break down this question in particular. It's asking which of the following can explain why the classical theory was rejected. So the classical theory in this case was referring to Rayleigh-Jean's law. So Rayleigh-Jean's law here. So I'm already focusing my attention onto this formula here. And it's mentioned these four options. So we can see that there's kind of a pairing in that C and D are referring to how spectral radiance diverges to infinity at particular wavelengths of light or frequencies of light, so ultraviolet and infrared. And then A and B is referring to a failure of this theory to consider temperature-dependent changes or frequency-dependent changes. So if we look at comparing Rayleigh-Jean's law and the revised Planck's kind of law, or the revision that Planck made on Rayleigh-Jean's law, I've already identified that both of them have this identical variables, meaning that they both have temperature, they both have the speed of light constant, the frequency, and Boltzmann's constant also within their formulas. The only thing that's differed from this formula, the Rayleigh-Jean's formula, to the revised formula, is that Planck has added Planck's constant here as h. So here I'm already discounting A and B because I've already identified that when we compare the classical theory to the revised theory of Planck, there hasn't been any significant change in terms of how temperature or frequency have been presented here. Instead, they both have the same variables that are being accounted for, and there's only an addition of a constant, like I mentioned before. So with that in mind, I'm already looking against A and B, and I'm focusing my attention to C and D. So it's talking about the spectral radiance diverges to infinity. Well, it's kind of difficult to identify this idea of spectral radiance or how it can diverge to infinity. So there's a need in some cases to unpack what the formula is presenting. So I might just annotate and then that might give you a clearer understanding of where I'm coming from. So if we look at this formula, we know that frequency is presented as V squared. And then if we scroll down, we know that V equals C, which is the speed of light, divided by the wavelength. So then if I go here, I can essentially divide, or I can replace V squared as C over the wavelength squared. And if I do that, I can do C over C squared over the wavelength squared. And I notice that if this is in the formula, it appears as essentially a hyperbola. So I hope a few of you know what I'm referring to with the hyperbola, but essentially it's a graph that is shaped in a way where, yeah. So that would be the graph that we would see with C squared over wavelength squared if we were to replace V squared with the wavelength. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a scroll and notice what it's asking. So it's saying the spectral radiance diverges to infinity at ultraviolet light frequencies, or the spectral radiance diverges to infinity at infrared light frequencies. So we notice here that from this graph, that UV visible light has a shorter wavelength compared to infrared. So in this graph, I'm just going to label the x-axis for you to make it a bit clearer. The wavelength would be represented as the x-axis, and the spectral radiance would be the y-axis here. So we notice that the UV visible light is closer to 0 compared to the infrared in terms of wavelength. So with that in mind, if we essentially put these points or label these points on this graph, we notice that infrared or IR is approximately further down the x-axis compared to UV. And with that in mind, we can identify that in this case, the spectral radiance diverges to infinity at the ultraviolet frequency, essentially, or in this case, when we're drawing the graph, that wavelength in particular. Okay. So then with that, so that question, the answer was C. And then when we move on to question 2, it's asking about the unit of Boltzmann's constant. Might just have a quick check of it. Yeah, I just looked at the second graph, that the A graph line. Yeah, so that wasn't essentially the method that we were expecting students to take. There is a bit more to this graph that needs to be explained in order to utilize this. It was quite fortunate that you were able to come to the right conclusion, but yeah, we'll go through it as we do, and then it might make it more of an understanding for you guys. So if we look at question 2, it's asking about the unit of Boltzmann's constant. So I'm immediately thinking, okay, I have to figure out what Boltzmann's constant is referring to. So we see here that Boltzmann's constant is referring to this essentially symbol here, so KB or KB here. So if I was to look at KB and trying to find the units, I'd essentially need to figure out what the units for BT are, or essentially the units for this function. And the unfortunate thing is that they don't provide those units. So I'm already kind of stuck as to where I can go with this. Because although we might have the units for V squared or V, and we have the unit for T, which is Kelvin, and C squared being meters per second, we don't have the units for the function as a whole, and we need that in order to figure out what KB is. So with that in mind, I look at other options. So I look at where else KB is presented. And we see KB being presented in this revised formula by Planck. And there's an important point that students need to pick up, or you guys needed to pick up in order to answer this question. And that's just generally looking at this number, the exponential, e to the power of needs to be essentially a constant, meaning that all of the variables within here need to cancel out so that there are no units involved. So with that in mind, what I'd be doing is I'd be essentially, if I draw it, I'll be going HV divided by KB times T, and I'd be essentially substituting those units in. So what is the unit of H? Well, I know it's meters squared times kg divided by s, or in this case, I'm just going to do s to the -1. And then I look at what v is. I also notice that v is s to the -1, so I go s -1. And then divided by kb, which is what we're trying to find, times by temperature, which is Kelvin. So remember, I said that there should be all the units cancelling in this case. So then I figure out, what does KB need to be in order for all of the units within this expression to cancel. So I notice that KB needs to be m squared kilograms s to the -2 divided by Kelvin. And you can test it yourself, but if I were to essentially substitute this as KB, I would be cancelling out all the units. So then I scroll down again and I look at what the options are. And I go, okay, well, all the s squareds are at the bottom, which is right. Yeah, so the answer in this case was kilograms times meters squared divided by Kelvin on s squared. So in summary, I'll just quickly say it again, and then you guys can follow through with it and attempt it yourself again in the future. What you need to identify is that the power of E needs to be essentially without any units. It needs to be just a number. So then in this case, what we need to do is we need to unpack this expression, and we got to figure out what Boltzmann's constant needs to be in terms of units in order to cancel the units that are being provided by H and V and T. And what we get is essentially the answer A. I'm just going to move on. If you guys do have questions about question 2 again, I am happy to explain it again at the end, if that was a bit of trouble. But if we just look at question 3, in figure 1, which of the following curves depicts Rayleigh-Jean's law? Well, I mentioned before that when we converted Rayleigh-Jean's law using wavelengths rather than frequency, we get a hyperbola. So with that in mind, all we have to do is look at these graphs, and we got to figure out which one of these is a hyperbola, and what we're left with is A, because all of these are essentially some kind of modified parabola in a sense, while this is most likely the shape of a hyperbola, whereby it approaches a certain number. So with that in mind, question 3 was A. Which of the curves shows the emission spectrum of the highest temperature ideal blackbody in an experiment? Okay, so in this question, what we need to identify is that essentially, first of all, it's talking about in an experiment. So that gives a clue as to which formula that we need to be using in relation to temperature. What we noticed is that Rayleigh-Jean's law was essentially a theoretical law that was being provided. And it was something that was being revised by Planck and is what provided this formula. And considering the fact that Rayleigh-Jean's law had held, it's more likely that we are using Planck's constant to figure out what the answer to the question was. So if we look at this formula, and we notice where temperature is involved, we notice that, again, I'm just going to annotate just to help you guys follow. If we look at temperature, if we notice that temperature, if we increase the temperature here, we notice that the denominator would also increase dramatically. And as a result of this denominator increasing, this number as a whole would decrease. And as this number decreases, what it does is it essentially approaches basically a very small number. It basically approaches a very small number, and it's approaching 0. So if we go e to the power of 0, we know that anything to the power of 0 equals 1. So thereby, this whole number, as temperature increases, is going to approach 1. So let's just imagine the number being 1.0001, a very, very, very close number to 1. If we minus that from 1, we would get a very small number. And then if we divide this whole denominator by 1, we would get a very large number. This portion of this formula. So I've already established a relationship here. I've already established that as we increase the temperature, we're going to see an increase in this function here. Because like I mentioned before, increasing temperature increases the denominator, which would decrease essentially the power of E, which would approach 1, which would mean that this denominator would be quite small. And as a result, this number as a whole would be quite large. So I'm going to write that here just for the sake of reminder. So increase with temperature results in an increase in BV. So I scroll down again. And it's saying which of the curves showcases the emission spectrum of the highest temperature ideal blackbody in an experiment. Well, if it's the highest temperature, this all makes sense because the higher the temperature, that's what we've been testing with this formula, because I've put a very high number as T. Essentially, I've substituted T as a very high number. So with that in mind, if we know that an increase in temperature increases the spectral radiance, looking at these graphs, we can notice that the highest peak can be observed with graph B. So essentially, the answer to this question was curve B, because we already discounted A because we know that A was a representation of Rayleigh-Jean's law, and we're left with B, C, and D, and we notice that B has the highest peak, and as temperature increases, we know that spectral radiance increases. So this is most likely the graph that represents this black body with the highest temperature. Finally, let's just have a look at question 5. So this question is essentially quite quite a difficult question in that it requires essentially you to substitute certain numbers within the within this formula, and it requires you to then thereby figure out what the answer is. So it's essentially a case of where we have to substitute numbers within this formula in order to get the answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the working out just because I think that might be a bit easier than if I were to write it out myself. So I just have this here. So if I were to substitute it, we notice that the temperature is 25,000 Kelvin, which is represented as 2.5 times 10 to the power of 4. And then we notice that the frequency is 5 times 10 to the 14, which I've substituted here. And I've just gone ahead and simply done some simple exponential calculations, and using the rules related to powers and multiplying powers together, and the addition of powers when we multiply them, for example. And it's just a case of just having to go through and manually and methodically make sure that you kind of reach that 1 times 10 to the negative 6, which was the final answer in this case. There's not much to it. It is quite laborious in terms of what the question is asking you to do. So for that sake, it could be a question that you might skip over and try and attempt the other questions first before you come back to it at a future stage. But it is, like I mentioned, just a case of plugging in numbers and then kind of transposing and deciphering and simplifying the powers and the number of powers here. So just quickly, I might just quickly get through the rest of the questions if I can, and see how I go. In particular, I did want to focus on question 10, because again, I think there was a few people who had trouble with this question in particular. So I might just do this one, and then the rest of the questions we have provided kind of worked solutions for, so you can have a look at it in your own time. But for question 10, if we were to just break it down quickly, we notice that it's asking for how much gunpowder rounded to the nearest gram we would use to fire the bullet. So this is again a case of having to take a methodical kind of approach to answering this question and figuring out what information do I have available to me, and then what do I need to do in order to reach the final answer. So here I would first begin with using the kinematics equation, where we essentially use v squared equals u squared plus 2as, because I want to figure out the acceleration in this case. So v squared, I notice, is already given to me in that it's 500. So I just substitute that in. 500 squared equals u squared, which I notice is 0 because at the start, the bullet is stationary with just loaded within the gun, plus 2 times the acceleration, which is what I want to find. And then S is the displacement. So I notice that the barrel is of a length of 50 centimeters. So importantly, changing that to the appropriate units, I notice that we are in meters, so I would go 0.5 meters. So simplifying that, we get 250,000 equals A. So I notice that A in this case is equal to 250,000 meters per second squared. Okay, so I've figured out the acceleration. So what's the next step in this case? Well, the next step in this case is to figure out the force that was applied to the bullet in order for it to shoot out of the gun at a velocity of 500 meters per second. So I think about what formula I can use. I can use the simple equation of F equals ma, because I already know what the acceleration is. I've just worked that out. And I've noticed that I have the mass already available to me. So it's a simple case of 5, sorry, it shouldn't be 5 because it has to be in kilograms, unfortunately. So in this case, it will be 0.05 times 250,000, which equals to 5 times 250, which equals to 1,250 newtons of force. So what I've done here is I've kind of simplified this into this, because if I'm able to move this decimal point 3 ways this way, I can simply move the decimal point 3 points this way. And I get a force of 1,250 newtons. So I get out the force that's being applied to the bullet in order for it to exit the gun at a velocity of 500 meters a second. Now I have to figure out how many grams of gunpowder was used in order for that to happen. And I noticed that here, the force that is applied to the bullet is 100 newtons for each centimeter squared of surface area of the bullet per gram of gunpowder used. So with that in mind, I noticed that if the amount of force is 100 per surface area of bullet per gram, I need to figure out the surface area in this case, because that's not provided to me. So in order to figure out the surface area, I need to again look at the question stem and identify what information is available to me. And I noticed that the bullet is 9 millimeters in diameter. So then I would be doing, again, a quick calculation to figure out the surface area. So then I know that the surface area formula is pi r squared. So then r in this case would be 0.45 squared times pi equals the surface area. So with that in mind, I approximate 0.45 squared as 0.2025. And that's a case of just simple mathematics that you might want to do in your mind. 0.2025 times by pi, and pi approximately is 3. So 3 times 0.2025 is approximately 0.6. So then I go, okay, 0.6. Yeah. 0.45, exactly, Radhika. So if I go, so I'm just going to continue on and I'm just going to finish this question before it cuts out again. And then you guys can have a look at the work solutions in your own time. And then if you have any further questions, you can always feel free to message me. But I'm going to start off by saying again, just going to go back to the idea that I have force already provided, so 1,250, and I know the surface area as being 0.6. And what I've got left to do is figure out the grams of gunpowder. So if I know that for every 100 newtons, there's essentially for every surface area to gram, to figure out the amount of grams that's required to exert a force of 1,250, all I have to do in this case is to figure out, basically plug in 1,250 equals 100 times the surface area of that certain bullet, so 0.6, times by the grams of gunpowder, which I'm trying to figure out. So with that in mind, I get essentially 12.5 divided by 0.6, which would be approximately 20 grams of gunpowder. So the answer here was A. Hopefully that made somewhat a bit of sense. I know it was quite difficult because of all the interruptions with my shoddy Wi-Fi. I might just have a quick look at the questions. If there were any. I don't think there were. Well, there are no questions because I just came in, but I'll just wait a couple minutes to see if there are any questions. But if not, I might pass it back to either Sarah or Eliza to make any final remarks.
Yeah, Mish, can you answer in the chat as before?
Sorry?
I might copy and paste it down for him because I think when he cut out, the question got lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was a question here. I think Eliza's just messaged me.
Do you have any suggestions on where to find a list of the numerical reasoning rules that they need to know?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think some of the numerical reasoning rules like that, those exponential kind of ideas of using powers and multiplying powers and how we use that, they are quite fundamental, and there is a tendency for GAMSAT and ACER to expect that you have some kind of idea as to how to decipher those kinds of mathematical reasonings. So I would, if I have the time, brush up on those. Look at, I'm sure in any textbook they'll have those rules widely available or even on the internet. So I would take the time to maybe brush up on those. And they are just rules. So there's not a case of having to memorize a large chunk of information. As long as you know the fundamentals, you'll be able to apply them to any question that's being provided. In terms of kinematics as well, the fact that I use that formula v squared equals u squared plus 2as, again, that was something that was assumed by ACER. There is some content of section 3 that they expect of you again. Just that basic understanding of physics, year 12 physics in particular, might be, again, something that they expect, and they might not provide that information to you. For question 6 to 9, any suggestions? I did quick. So let me just have a look at question 6 to 9. Yeah, so again, these were questions designed around quick mathematical reasoning. If I were to kind of mention anything, it would be the fact that you kind of try and round numbers as you go, especially if you look at the options that are available to you with the questions. If you notice that there's a large disparity in terms of the percentages, for example, it can give you a good idea about the kind of freedom, or not the freedom, but the leeway that they provide. So that might be a good indication that, okay, here I might be able to round that number to a number that's a bit more easier to manage when I'm like kind of going through the question in particular. So that's something that I would keep in mind. Yeah, and again here, question 9 was notorious for that as well. It was not a lot of heavy maths, but it's a case of trying to identify how you can simplify what mathematical methods that you're using. So if I were to quickly go here, it's asking for what is the estimate for the total number of AIDS cases in white, Hispanic, and black non-Hispanic. due to male-to-male contact. So I'd be looking at the percentage, and I'd notice that here it would be around 70%, and then 70% of 48,422. So here I would immediately be like, okay, I'm not going to obviously do 48,422 times 70% of that number. I'd already be going, all right, 50,000 and then 70% of that number instead. And then just keeping that in the back of my mind potentially, and realizing that the number that I do calculate will be slightly larger than the actual number that I would obtain. Hopefully that helps there. Were there any questions, other questions that were coming in?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit to Heba's question, because I think that this is something a lot of people are concerned about, especially with the changing, I guess, climate of the GAMSAT currently, and particularly with the number of questions being altered. So firstly, I know that a common technique is for people to pick and choose the questions which are most suited to their strengths on the GAMSAT day. So the first thing that I would say is that the GAMSAT is about, in your preparations, is about working on your weaknesses, and on the day is about working at your strengths. So first and foremost, spend the day using techniques which help you to highlight your strengths. So that's what I would say to do first, is still do those questions first that you find you're best at and that you're good at. However, in your preparations between now and then, those questions that you feel you're really struggling with, don't ignore them or shy away from them just because it's like, I really don't like the maths, physics questions. In fact, that's what I'd be spending most of my time on right now, would be making sure that those are okay and that you're practicing them and that you're learning tips that are actually helpful for you. And then on the day, you can still do them last, but 100% would recommend that you attempt them at the very least. My philosophy, or like my theory on this all, is still I would rather students do things with quality and take time to do them and do them well and get more questions right than get less questions right because you're rushing to try and finish it all. So if that is what the sort of trade-off is for you, and you know that you won't finish if you try and put time into the maths questions, ignore the maths questions and wait till the end, but otherwise still be having a go at them. Do I think that you'll be disadvantaged using this technique now that there's less questions versus when there were more questions before? No, I don't. The proportions of the different types of questions will remain the same. They'll still have the same breakdown. And so in terms of like whether your technique is a good technique versus whether it's changed now that the question number has changed, that's less of an issue. So don't stress about the question numbers changing. I know that it's stressful when things are different to what you're used to, but this isn't something that I would be worrying about. They're going to be testing the same styles of things. They're going to be testing the same kinds of knowledge. They're going to be testing the same criteria. It's just going to be a slightly smaller pool, or a much-ish, like it's half the size, I think, pool of questions, but still you're being tested on the same thing. So yeah, for now, focus on your weaknesses, go away and find ways to help improve on those things, look for really helpful resources, and then on the day, just do your best. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
If I could just add to what Sarah said, what I'd mention, and it's something that I mention to my students as well, is the idea that if you are able to, in an actual exam, focus on the questions that you're most suited to, there is a bit of self-confidence that you gain when you do answer those questions and you're able to get through a large portion of what you're comfortable with. And it does help in the grand scheme of things when it comes to getting through all of section 3, and particularly the questions that you were most comfortable with. It's something that I felt in particular is that when you were able to reach essentially the last question, even if you skipped a few of them that you were not particularly fond of or had a bit of difficulty with, it can give you a bit of relief knowing that you've at least attempted the ones that you felt you were strong at. And furthermore, when you go back to those tougher questions, you might have a newer perspective or a slightly different perspective when you try and attempt that question, and that can be really good, that new, fresh, like state of mind when it comes to answering that question, and it can give you those bonus marks that you need in order to kind of bump up your section 3 score, for example, as well.
Yeah, cool. Just as a couple little questions that have come through. Yes, I'm going to wrap up by talking through a few little study tips. In terms of reasoning-based and needing a background to succeed, you don't necessarily need to have come from a science or maths background. However, definitely there is a level of expected foundational knowledge. So whilst there's no requirement, or whilst I have seen that people who have a science background might find it initially easier because some of the things they've already learned, you definitely can still succeed without having that background, but you do need to walk in having a foundational level of knowledge. If you're not sure, there are heaps of resources online to help you know what kinds of things you are expected to walk in knowing. And then once you know that level of things, everything beyond that is reasoning and using that knowledge wisely and with a reasoning-based approach. So it is a bit tricky. Sometimes it does involve a little bit more work, but I promise it's worth it. If it's where you want to be, truly, it's 100% worth it. So that's something to keep in mind on those rainy days when you know that you have to sit down and crack through some physics and work out a couple of things. Yeah. In terms of study, I just really quickly am going to show you guys one thing and then we will wrap up.
I'll just stop sharing.
That's all right. I think we're good. What? It's telling me to enter a password. Okay. All of this now. But basically, in that strategies workshop that Eliza linked you all to before, I spent the first 15 minutes going over my tips to study efficiency, especially for the GAMSAT and especially in light of the GAMSAT being at the end of May. If you were in one of those classes or you've been in my classes before, you will have heard this from me before, but if you haven't, it's a really good resource to go onto, and we will include templates that I talk about here in the email that we send out after this session. But basically, just a couple things to go away with. It does talk about how to set goals, especially what I just mentioned about focusing on your weaknesses now rather than your strengths, and how to fit those into your study timetable. So that's something I'd be really focusing on at the moment. So it goes over how to make study goals. This is one of my favorite slides and favorite concepts. I call it the less is plenty concept, basically formed on the less is more idea. But I believe that it not only is less more, less is plenty if you do it properly. And so I love these graphs. You can get a bunch of these on Google, and they're basically just correlation causation graphs, and show that just because things correlate doesn't mean that they cause each other. And so this one's an example of divorce rates in Maine and how much margarine was eaten, and obviously just because the graph looks like this doesn't mean that eating more margarine causes divorce or vice versa. And it's exactly the same with your GAMSAT planning and preparation. Just because someone does more study than you or is doing 40 hours of study or whatever at the GAMSAT does not automatically mean that they'll get a better GAMSAT score. So I love reminding people this. To give you an indication, I have examples. You can see them in the strategies class. I go through it much slower and more detailed. But I had a rule of thumb that I would never spend on average more than 2 hours a day doing GAMSAT things. And I would always focus most on the things that I was weakest at. And that included a section by section thing. So if I was weakest at section 1, then I would be spending more time with that. And if I was weakest at annotating within section 1, that's what I would be focusing on. Also, the last little bit I'll tell you about now is that you should be reflecting, and a good chunk of your time when you are doing your GAMSAT preparation and study should not actually be doing questions themselves or writing essays, but you should be properly reflecting. So things like using that essay rubric that I showed you guys before, and actually working out, what did I do wrong with this question? What do I need to know to fix that? Or what technique do I need to use? And going away and working that out. So like with the poetry, finding out different kinds of poetry conventions, or like with what Mish went over, going away and finding out those kinds of maths formulas that you might need to know. So that's what I would recommend. go away, have a look at how I run through that on the strategies masterclass. It's much clearer because I spend a solid 15 minutes just talking through study scheduling. But yeah, hopefully that helps you to sort of set up a study schedule for the next month or so leading up to the GAMSAT. Yeah. All right. So just to wrap up, I think Eliza has a few things to say. I'll just grab up your slides for you, Eliza. Sorry, guys. Why can't you see them? That's a bit strange. Can everyone see these slides? Yes? All right. Sorry. Okay. Here we go. Beautiful.
Cool. So did you want to do this reflective task?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Absolutely. So just to wrap it up, thanks so much for tuning in tonight, guys. You've done it. You've done one of our mini mocks. It's been so fun. I love going over this stuff. I love creating these for you guys. Yeah, it's why I do this. So I want you all to write in the chat one thing that you've learned from sitting the mock, and or a goal that you're going to set between now and sitting the GAMSAT at the end of May / start of June. So yeah, we love seeing these come through in the chat. So please send them in now so we can have a bit of a look. It's
Thank
like
goodness.
Yeah, go for it, Liz. I'll hand it back over to you. But yeah, please keep writing in the comments.
Awesome. If we hop onto the next slide, I know that one of the students before Aruj asked, are we going to run any more of these sort of mini mocks? So we've already run a mini mock before. If you haven't watched it, I can link it down below. But we do have full mock exams that you can sit, which are so much more, I guess, valuable because you're actually sitting real-timed practice. So if we hop over to the next slide, I'll just explain how you can enroll into that. Well, first of all, I guess we do a ton of free things. As I mentioned, there are a ton of free mock exams that we already do, like the strategy masterclass, for instance. So I'm going to link here. Definitely join our Facebook community, and I'll link the link to that here if you haven't already, because that is where we post all of our free things so that you don't miss out on anything, such as things like that masterclass or the mini mock. And you can always go back to rewatch them if you can't sit them live, even though we very much recommend that you sit them live. And secondly, as I mentioned, if we hop over to the next slide, something that you can do in terms of to help your own preparation is that before the actual exam, this end of May, we do have the 3 weekends beforehand. We are holding online mock exams, just like the content you've gone through. So if you have and you haven't enrolled yet, please, do so if you want to. It is $159 for 3 mock exams, and that comes with you sitting live, which is about like 6 hours, I think, from me. And you also get the whole reporting on it, all the answers and explanations, as well as your own results and your cohort results. So it's very much a tool that we recommend that you use to be able to diagnose where those weaknesses are for that exam. And these are all original questions that our GAMSAT tutors have written. So it's a fresh new resource. I'll pop that there if you have not. Sorry, someone just said, I can't find a link to the mock exams. Got it, sent it. And if you hop over next slide, so they do start on next Saturday, which is the 9th of May, and we do hold our mock exams on Saturdays and Sundays. So as you see, there's a schedule there, and ideally that is how you mock exam, and we'll be giving you that timing As noted, on every Thursday after the mock weekends, you will get those results released to you. And those enrollments do close next Saturday. So if you do want to be enrolling in that, please do so. And then we'll hop over to the next slide. Again, there have been a few students who have been able to make, for instance, 2, but not the 3rd mock, and all the tuition fees from the mock exams do go towards making an impact on a specific cause. And previously, as I mentioned, all of our sort of funds go towards giving communities in rural Philippines access to free health education. But as now, we very much are putting all the proceeds towards a COVID-19 response, and that is amazing to be able to do, I think, for students who want to become the future health professionals, to really be supporting the current health professionals who are really overworked at the moment. And then if we go over to the next slide, so in terms of actually enrolling, and if you do have any issues with sort of dates, Carlene is our operations manager and someone who so this is for any of the sort of students who are listening to this recording or doing this live. For tonight only, there is a promo code of, and if section 2. Oh no, I'm cutting out. Sorry, I cut out.
That's all right.
The promo code.
Are you all good?
Yeah.
Yep.
The promo code there. Tutors will retrieve a second view of full feedback end of the week. Apparently, I'm still cutting out.
That's all right.
Sarah,
I can tell them. Yeah. So obviously we would love to give you guys all feedback for, like, proper marked feedback for the essays that you've written tonight. Unfortunately, that's really difficult for us to do because we're currently writing hundreds of questions for our mock exams and running classes and doing many other things, but we would love to see you in our mock exams. And if you came tonight and you sign up, you can use this promo code and we will give you marked proper feedback for the essays that you wrote this evening as like a gift from us and a thank you for signing up. It's something we like to do, is to give you an extra bonus for signing up and helping support us, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you as well. In terms of, I did skip a slide, that was my fault there, Liz, but this is Carlene's email. She is our operations manager and she takes care of logistical things, so we're super flexible. If you can't actually make a mock exam date but you would really love to sign up, or any other questions you might have, you're welcome to just email her about it and just let her know and she'll sort you out. She's really amazing with all of that and that's what she's there for, and she'd love to help. So yeah, just to wrap up, if you have any last questions, we don't want to hold you too long because I know this has gone really long already. I do hope it was super helpful for you though. But these are our emails. You're more than welcome to email us and ask any questions or follow up on anything we said that we send you but forget or anything like that. So we're super open to that as well. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. And
someone's asked
Liz has a little bit.
Yeah, someone's asked, when are you holding your next 6-week classes? I am taking the GAMSAT in September. So we do have a series of 6-week intensives that are currently running for the May sitting, and then we'll have another 6-week intensive slot for the September sitting, which will start in July. So as long as you are in that Facebook group and you've liked our Halad to Health page, you'll get notified about when we open those next 6-week classes. Heber has asked, do you run any Section 3 classes? Yes. Mish is one of the 3 tutors who are taking our Section 3 classes right now. And we have 2 other tutors who are taking Section 3 classes right now. They are in week 3 of the 6-week intensives. But if you still want to be part of the last 4 classes or the last 3 weeks of classes, just email Carlene and she can put you into a class. Yeah. Terrific. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we'll be emailing out all those answers and the link to this soon.
Thank you so
All right.
much for joining us.
Have a great night.
Bye.